The Jets begin training camp this week. What are the biggest storylines to watch? Well, obviously Aaron Rodgers. There are also some key players returning from injury. And who will the surprise contributors be for the Jets in 2023? We'll discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, July 17th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangReNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so that you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you're listening on a podcast source and enjoy the show, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help us out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Well, this is our first day back. We are now back in normal mode. We'll have new episodes each day, Monday through Friday, after a brief period where we were in a summer schedule. Things were a little bit more scaled back. Jets training camp begins in just a couple of days. Wednesday is the day the Jets players will report. It's an early training camp this year because the Jets are playing in the Hall of Fame game, as 2 New York Jets will be inducted in Canton, Ohio in a few weeks to the Hall of Fame, Darrelle Revis and Joe Klecko. So each season there is the first preseason game of the year, which takes place in Canton, Ohio. It's called the Hall of Fame game. It takes place around the Hall of Fame ceremonies. Usually the NFL puts in teams that have ties to the players who were just inducted, and with 2 Jets going in this year, it was kind of a no-brainer that they be part of the ceremony, which means that because they play this early preseason game against the only preseason game in week 1 of the exhibition season, the Jets will report to training camp a little bit earlier than the rest of the NFL. So what are the big storylines this year? Well, we're going to talk about that on today's episode. Now, I'm usually not a big fan of training camp and preseason, and giving the Jets an extra week normally is not something I'd be very excited about. This year for me is an exception, though, because I think that actually the extra preseason game and the extra training camp will benefit the Jets from the standpoint that they have a new quarterback, that there are a lot of new pieces coming into this team. So I think when you have like a new team, especially in key places like quarterback, it probably does benefit you to get a little bit of extra work. I think that's especially true of the preseason this year because training camp practices are so scaled back these days. There isn't as much hitting, not nearly as much hitting as there used to be. No more 2-a-days. Those are a thing of the distant past. You don't really get that many opportunities to prepare, at least in a situation simulating a game. So I think that this actually is a good thing for the Jets this year, that they get this to the extent it matters. And I don't want to overstate how much it matters, but I think to the extent it matters, getting the extra week is probably a benefit to this team. And that brings me to what's obviously going to be the number one story of training camp this year. And for the Jets, it's usually the quarterback position. But in recent years, over the last 15 years or so, the story of the quarterback position in training camp has either been, how's the rookie going to do? Or is the rookie going to improve? Or is the young quarterback who did not play so well last year going to improve? And that's been kind of an ongoing story. And one of the themes of training camp, since 2009, was this year the young quarterback looks so different. Things are going to be so much better for him this year. He's more comfortable in the system. This is just going to be a great year for the young quarterback. And as you know, it has not panned out. A little bit different this year when you got Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. Rodgers, of course, himself is a future Hall of Famer. He will undoubtedly be voted into the Hall of Fame 5 years after he retires. So this year, the storylines are all going to be about Aaron Rodgers. They're going to be about how different the team is. This year, it'll actually be genuine. Over the last couple of years, like last year with Zach Wilson or all the Sam Darnold years, the talk was always going to be about how, this team's so different this year because the young quarterback's ready to step up. And as we now know, none of those young quarterbacks were ever ready to step up. Zach Wilson was not last year. Sam Darnold was not for the years he was with the Jets. You could go back to Geno Smith, who finally was ready last year in Seattle, or go back even further to Mark Sanchez. These quarterbacks have not panned out for the Jets. So the talk this year is probably going to be about Rodgers and how different, and this year it'll actually be true how different things are going to be, because the Jets are going to enter the season with a pretty high degree of certainty that they're going to get good to very good quarterback play this year. And I think a lot of the questions will be how Rodgers is impacting everybody else on the team. And if you've been following the news stories through the OTAs, through the offseason program, people are saying that Rodgers is holding people accountable, that there's maybe leadership in the locker room that's been lacking. And the reason it's been lacking is that it's the type of thing that can only come from a quarterback with Aaron Rodgers' stature. So you'll hear a lot about that in training camp. And well, it's not, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's completely untrue. I do think that we'll find out more about the leadership of this team, when they hit the first rough patch of the regular season. This time of year, everybody's always talking about how great things are. I do think there is something to the idea, though, that maybe Rodgers brings an element. He brings a credibility that the Jets have lacked, though, in the past. So there's going to be a lot of talk about that. There's going to be a lot of talk about how Garrett Wilson and Aaron Rodgers are developing chemistry. There'll be a lot of talk about the new system that's being put in by Nathaniel Hackett, a system that Aaron Rodgers favors. I mean, this is going to be the Aaron Rodgers show. Obviously, one of the biggest storylines for the Jets this training camp is going to be their appearance on Hard Knocks, the great film, the great series documentary. It's on HBO. NFL Films produces it, and Rodgers is going to be the star of the show. And I talked about this a bit last week. Everything is going to be focused on Aaron Rodgers. I, for one, am kind of looking forward to this year's training camp because it's with this different vibe. I think there's going to be less hyperventilation about every day in practice. I think that when you have a young quarterback in there, everybody's always trying to figure out what's going on. Everybody's always trying to determine, based on a limited sample size, a few throws in practice, is this young quarterback improving? I think it leads to some overreactions. Like, I don't think there's anything that's a bigger overreaction than training camp statistics for a quarterback, because most of the time the statistics are just completion percentage, just how many passes attempts versus how many completed, which really doesn't tell you anything. Statistics at the quarterback position can be shaky on their best day, but when you're not including yardage, when you're not including yards per attempt, you really are learning nothing, because you could have a bad completion percentage and it's because the play calls for nothing but deep routes and nobody's getting open, or you could have a high completion percentage because you're just checking everything down and getting like 2-3 yards of play, which, yes, they count as completed passes on the stat sheet, but they don't really help your team out. So I'm kind of glad with this. I think that most of the stories are going to be about Aaron Rodgers, how he's assimilating to the team, what he's bringing to the team, again, as far as like work ethic, as far as things like, holding people accountable. I think it's going to be for at least for me, because I got kind of tired of every year hearing about how the young quarterback was different. Everything's different for him this year. He's more comfortable in the system. I'm looking forward to maybe a quieter period this year and more focus on just what Aaron Rodgers is bringing, because the Jets obviously added an all-time great quarterback to their team this year. And even if he's not quite what he used to be, he's 39. He's not 29 anymore. He's not even 34 anymore. He's going to bring something. He's going to give the Jets confidence heading into the season. They're not going to need to talk themselves into believing their quarterback's going to be good. They're going to know that he's good. And I think there's a big difference in the NFL between hoping for something and being confident in something. And this year, the Jets are going to be very confident, and rightly so, that they're going to get good quarterback play. And that's something we haven't heard about a lot with the Jets in recent years. I mean, this podcast has been going on since 2016. I'm not sure that there's ever been an offseason before where I've entered the season being completely confident that the Jets were going to get good quarterback play. But that's where we are right now, because Aaron Rodgers is on the team, and expectations are certainly high because they have the great quarterback. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue this Monday episode. We're going to turn our attention to something that could be just as critical as Aaron Rodgers this year. Believe it or not, there actually are topics that are important to the Jets that don't deal with Aaron Rodgers, and that's how some key players are going to recover from injuries. Jets have a lot of important starters who are coming off pretty serious injuries. We'll discuss them a little bit more as we continue on this Monday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. I mean, if you're the Jets, it's pretty easy because everybody knows. You could be a football fan, you could be a casual fan, you could be a diehard fan. Everybody knew this offseason that Aaron Rodgers was an all-time great quarterback. In your field, probably not as easy to figure out who the Aaron Rodgers is. And that's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. It's easy to create a free job post on LinkedIn Jobs, then add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. And this is why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers, folks who tune into the podcast Monday through Friday. We're back on our regular schedule now, so we'll have new episodes each day through the week, really heading through the season, through training camp, through the preseason, through the regular season, through the playoffs, even all the way through the draft. It's going to be a very exciting year for the New York Jets. And today we're talking about the beginning of that year. What are the big storylines in training camp? And well, Aaron Rodgers is clearly storyline #1. And kind of associated with that, I guess 1A is Hard Knocks, which is going to be the Aaron Rodgers show this year. Another key thing to watch for the Jets is just how injured players recover, because Jets have an awful lot of key players, guys who are very important to this team, coming off injuries. And it's especially true on the offensive side of the ball. Now, even with Aaron Rodgers in place, I think you can make a very strong case that this is still a team where the defense is ahead of the offense. And if the offense is going to play at a Super Bowl level, they're going to need guys to bounce back from injuries. And it'll be worth watching. Now, the way this works in training camp, if you're not familiar, is if a player is not healthy enough to begin practicing, he reverts to what's known as the physically unable to perform list. And that essentially means he's on this list until he's able to practice. He can come off it at any time during training camp. So, if he's ready the second day, he can come off the list then and start practicing. If he's ready, the last day of training camp, he can come off the list then. If the player, however, is on the physically unable to perform list at the end of the preseason, team either has to activate him to the 53-man roster or he has to sit out over a month. So and then he can't play for, it's well over a month that he can't actually play for the team. So something to watch. And the team actually has something that's known as the conditioning test. And each team has their own conditioning. It's exactly what it sounds like. It could be, run a 100-yard dash this many times in this many seconds. And depending on what position you play, the criteria may be different. But to come off the list, typically you have to pass that conditioning test. Now, who are the Jets who are coming off serious injuries? Well, #1, for me, and the more I've been thinking this through, the more I feel like Breece Hall might be the most important player on this roster this year, because I've talked a lot this offseason about the significance of the offensive line. And it's true. The thing with the offensive line, though, you need a lot to go right on that unit for the Jets. And that we'll get into some of the guys coming off injuries in a bit, but there's just an awful lot of guys who you need good seasons from. You need a bounce back season from Lake and Tomlinson. You need some other guys to bounce back from injuries. It's a lot to get all of those things in place. An alternative to that might just be Breece Hall coming back and being Breece Hall again, because he was phenomenal last year. The Jets were winning games when they were throwing for like 120 yards because Breece Hall was carrying the offense on his back. Now, it's a bit of a balance because Breece is obviously coming off a serious injury. You don't want to ask too much of him too soon. First of all, you want to make sure he's completely healthy when he's back in the lineup, because this is an important player. Last year, the Jets lost him in October. That team was never the same after they lost Breece Hall. They were 5-2 at the point of Hall's injury. They finished 7-10. And I know it's always dangerous in football. Football's a very complex game. Football's a game where, one player doesn't always make that big of a difference. But I think if you watched the Jets last year, you probably saw it. That injury really impacted the team. And it got to a point where, if he doesn't get hurt last year, I think the Jets are actually able to take a different approach with Zach Wilson, because Zach Wilson was not playing very well during that 4-game winning streak the Jets had. It's just they could live with it because nobody really, they were winning games, so it kind of flew under the radar. And you could say, well, they're winning games, so how bad could Zach Wilson be? We found out after Hall went down and after Hall was unable to cover for the passing game's deficiencies. And, when you think about quarterbacks in their late 30s, quarterbacks in their early 40s who have succeeded in the league, well, there's Tom Brady, who's, once in a league history, not a once in a generation, not a once in a lifetime, once in the history of the NFL type player. And after that, a lot of the quarterbacks who succeed, they kind of have had a really good running back to take some of the playmaking load off their shoulders. Brett Favre with Minnesota in 2009 with Adrian Peterson. You want to go back to the 90s, John Elway with Terrell Davis. And it's not that these quarterbacks weren't very good. They still were very good. they weren't quite what they used to be. And the running back kind of like helped bridge that gap. You had to do a lot, but you didn't have to do quite as much. And the other thing is Breece Hall ran last year dominantly behind an offensive line that was constantly being reshuffled. Jets had a million injuries on the line, and Hall was still able to produce. So that might help you work around the offensive line issues the Jets have if Breece Hall is healthy. And you hope that he is. And again, it's a balance because the most important thing is for Breece Hall to be himself, be fully healthy by November, December down the stretch, because the Jets really missed him in those late season games last year. So worth watching Breece Hall. How quickly can he get back to being himself? And I think the Jets really would be wise to limit his touches early in the season. But a lot of it depends on how he's feeling, and if he's able to take on maybe a bigger load, it would be a big boost to the team. Now, across the offensive line, you have a lot of players coming off injuries. And Dwayne Brown, who really gutted through a rotator cuff injury last year. That was, I remember he got hurt before the first game of the regular season, or he was injured. And I remember like being baffled by it because he had barely played in the preseason. He was pretty seriously hurt, and he gutted out pretty much a 3/4 of a season. He came back, 3-4 weeks, and he wasn't vintage Dwayne Brown. I mean, I don't think you'd expect Dwayne Brown in his late 30s to be I don't think you'd expect a guy in his late 30s to be a dominant player, even if he was a great player in his prime. But he gave the Jets what as much as you could reasonably expect from somebody who was really an emergency signing, because they signed him after Mekhi Becton got injured. There's been talk the Jets are maybe a little worried about Dwayne Brown's recovery because it's a serious injury. It's not an easy thing to recover from as an offensive lineman. And I think the Jets are focused on Dwayne Brown at left tackle. And I've said this a long time. I feel like left tackle is one of those positions you just don't want to be a disaster. Listen, you'd love to have an all-pro there. You'd love to have a dominant force there. But the most important thing about left tackle is not being a disaster. Kelvin Beachum was a really important player for the Jets for a number of years because he wasn't great, but he at least prevented the position from being a disaster. A disaster at left tackle can sink your season. That's especially true when you have a 39-year-old quarterback. So having Dwayne Brown in there, that's a helpful thing. And I think the Jets certainly hope he'll be back. Mekhi Becton, obviously a key player. If Breece Hall is the number one most important player on this team, at least as far as recovering from an injury goes, Mekhi Becton's number two because he's got the ability. We know he was a top 11 pick in 2020, and he had a pretty good rookie season. The question is, can he stay on the field? So is he ready to go this year? Last year there were some indications that maybe he came back a little too early. Becton certainly did not seem to feel like the coaching staff handled him well. If Becton can stabilize right tackle, it's a huge boost for the Jets. I don't think you can overstate how significant that would be for the New York Jets if Mekhi Becton is back and fully healthy and feeling like himself again. It turns a problem area, it turns a question mark area into a solid area. So Mekhi Becton, how healthy is he? Is he ready to go? Is he 100%? That's something worth watching. And then the third guy on the offensive line is Elijah Vera Tucker, who was a key player on the offensive line last year because he kept moving around. And now in his 2 seasons, he's played 4 of the 5 spots on the offensive line. He is the only position he has not started games on the offensive line is center, and he's played pretty well in every place he's been. So if you suffer an injury, Vera Tucker shown an ability to kick out, even though he's going to start the season at guard, he's shown an ability to kick out to either tackle spot and play well there and hold up. So another key guy. And this part of this shows you why the offensive line is such a question mark, because you have all these guys coming back off injuries. And if they're able to stay healthy, the Jets could have a credible line. If they don't, they may have some issues unless somebody else steps up. And as we continue on this Monday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about our final training camp storyline. Who are the players who are going to come out of nowhere and earn a role on the team? Could it be, an offensive lineman the Jets drafted last year, like Max Mitchell? Well, we'll discuss it in a little bit more detail, continuing this Monday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're talking about training camp, which begins this week for the Jets, an early start to training camp because they are in the Hall of Fame game this year. So the Jets get to go to camp a little bit early. They get a week jump on the rest of the league. In fact, the Jets canceled their mandatory mini camp. At the end of the offseason program, each team is allowed to conduct a mini camp where players are required to attend. The rest of the offseason program is voluntary. The mini camp is typically mandatory, but the Jets canceled it this year because they said, you know what? We're going to camp a week early, so we'll just replace that mini camp with the early start at training camp. Now, we've talked about Aaron Rodgers. We've talked about players recovering from injuries. One of the staples of training camp every year, though, are the players who've improved, the players who are ready to step up into a bigger role And sometimes there are surprising players. I can think back to 2016, and this was a rookie, Robbie Anderson, who entered the season or entered training camp as kind of a long shot to make the roster. And then he didn't just make the roster. He earned a spot easily. I mean, he was like a no doubter going into cutdown day. It wasn't even a case where an undrafted guy barely sticks. He was able to earn his roster spot. Or Damon Harrison, you go back a few years earlier, who developed into an excellent nose tackle for the Jets. Sometimes it happens, and you got to be careful because there are also guys who get a lot of hype in the early stages of training camp who maybe aren't able to sustain that and maybe aren't as good going forward. I mean, I remember back in like 2013, I think it was, there's this undrafted center the Jets had, Dalton Freeman out of Clemson. And for whatever reason, like he kept getting, there was this one day where he got hyped up in the media, and like for 2 years after that, people were, because he got so hyped up in training camp, people acted like he was going to be the successor to Nick Mangold, and it never made sense. So you got to be careful. And that same training camp as Robbie Anderson, there were also a lot of hype around a couple of young receivers, Jalen Marshall and Sharon Peake, who never developed. So it's important to keep this in mind. It's important to keep these things in perspective. It's, if you flash in training camp, it could be a first step. It could be, hey, this guy's looking good. And then you have to sustain it through the preseason, and then hopefully into the regular season, you've carved out a role. But it's important. It's worth keeping an eye on. It's just, don't go crazy the first time you hear a name. But if you keep hearing it over and over, that's a guy worth watching in the preseason to see if he can sustain it. And maybe it's a sign he is taking his game to the next level. Now, who are some of the guys you could keep an eye on for the Jets heading into camp? Max Mitchell got a lot of buzz in the offseason program. We'll see how well it lasts. Mitchell, guy who was really pressed into starting duty last year because of all the injuries the Jets had at tackle and was not ready. I think he tried hard, but last year was clearly a year where I think the Jets were hoping he'd get in the weight room, because the issue with him was just he physically was not up to it. He needed to add strength. He needed to add bulk. He got pushed around a lot. But maybe that experience will be good for him this year, because now he's got starting experience. Now he's got playing experience. And I just told you about the question marks the Jets have at the tackle position. Now, hopefully everything works out for Dwayne Brown, and hopefully everything works out for Mekhi Becton. But if it doesn't, Max Mitchell stepping in and at least being able to hold the fort, at least showing he could be a good backup, that'd be a huge deal for the Jets. That's the type of thing that could add stability. And again, I go back to what I say at the tackle position. I said it about left tackle. I'll say it about right tackle. It's almost as important just to not be a disaster as it is to be great there. So if you have a credible guy at tackle, especially with Aaron Rodgers, a quarterback who knows what he's doing with the football, just get a credible guy there. It can make it'll make all the difference in the world for the Jets. Another guy who's worth watching could be a guy, Jamie Sherwood, who the Jets, of course, drafted a few years ago. He's been getting a lot of buzz, and at this point, at the point of we're recording this, and of course, the way things are going this offseason, the Jets will sign Quan Alexander immediately, because I'm saying this, which wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. I like Quan. I'd love to see him back, but Quan Alexander's still unsigned at the time we're recording this. It may just be that they're going to work out a deal. It was pretty late last year that the Jets signed Quan. We were pretty late in the offseason process. Is it also a sign, though, that the Jets believe Jamie Sherwood could step into that third linebacker role? I mean, possibly. And I think it's very easy to overstate the third linebacker role in the Robert Saleh defense in this day and age. It's a part-time role. It's a guy who's going to be on the field about half the time. He's not a full-time player. So can Jamie Sherwood step into that role? And if he's getting a lot of buzz in the early part of training camp, maybe that's a sign the Jets are ready to roll with him. And that's one of the things about the NFL. You got to have surprising guys step into roles. You don't necessarily need a non-drafted guy to become a star. You don't necessarily need a day 3 pick to become an all-pro. But you got to have guys who come out of nowhere, young guys, late-round picks, undrafted free agents, who are able to step into critical roles. Sometimes they're depth roles. Sometimes they're part-time roles, sub-package roles. It needs to happen. And the third guy I've got my eye on is Jermaine Johnson. His rookie year, played sparingly. I think it's got to happen for him, in part because he's not young. He was pretty old for a guy who was a draft pick. So he's getting to like his mid-20s, and at that point you're kind of close if you're not at your physical peak. So the rookie year is always a bit of an adjustment year, but I think it's go time for Jermaine Johnson. I think this year we'll know what we have in Jermaine Johnson. I mean, I would be surprised if this year wasn't a sign of what he's going to be for the rest of his career. Now, is that a good starter? Well, you hope so. That's why the Jets drafted him. Jets are hoping he's going to be like an 8 to 10 sack guy who plays the run really well. If he does that, he'll be a phenomenal pick. Is he more of a part-time player? Or is he just going to be kind of a rotational guy like he was last year? Well, what I'm hoping to hear is that he's flashing in the early stages of training camp, because that'll be a sign that maybe things are moving forward, that maybe, you got something on your hands here. And that'll be an exciting thing. And of course, Will McDonald, the Jets just drafted, and other guys, is he going to beat expectations? I remember back in 2020. This may not be the best reference because of what's happened since his rookie year, but Mekhi Becton was a guy I was a little skeptical on heading into 2020, because I felt like maybe his game needed a little bit more development before he was ready to take on a prominent role. Well, as it turned out, Becton was ready. He was further along than I realized, or a lot of other people realized. So while I'm expecting Will McDonald to kind of be a part-time player this year, a 3-sack, sub-package guy would be good. Can he be a little bit more? And if he can, then perhaps the Jets have something on their hands. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help us out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.